"You can't sit here. This seat is not for you." Those words cut through the air like a knife. Passengers sitting nearby looked up, surprised, their conversations fading as they tried to understand what was happening. The man being spoken to wasn't loud. He wasn't causing any trouble. He had simply walked into the first-class cabin, found his assigned seat, and was about to sit down. But that short, dismissive sentence stopped him in his tracks. The man was David Cole. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked like a regular traveler. He wasn't wearing a flashy business suit, he didn't carry a designer briefcase, and he wasn't surrounded by assistants or bodyguards. Instead, David wore a plain black hoodie, some comfortable jeans, and a pair of sneakers. He dressed the way many people like to when flying, casual, simple, and relaxed. But for the flight attendant standing in front of him, that hoodie seemed to say only one thing, that he didn't belong in first class. David, however, was no ordinary passenger. Behind that casual hoodie was the mind of a billionaire. He was the CEO of Horizon Tech, one of the biggest tech companies in the United States, a man who had built his empire from the ground up. His face had been on magazine covers, he had spoken at major conferences, and he was respected around the world as a leader. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing the attendant saw was a man in a hoodie, and she made a snap judgment that would soon change her life forever. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy," she said, her voice sharp, firm, and laced with condescension. She didn't whisper. She didn't pull him aside quietly. She spoke loudly enough that several other first-class passengers turned to look, some raising eyebrows, others just shaking their heads as though they'd seen this kind of thing before. David didn't get angry. He didn't shout or cause a scene. Instead, he calmly handed over his boarding pass, showing her the bold black letters that read, "First Class, Seat 2A. He thought maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe she hadn't looked closely enough. But as her eyes scanned the ticket and her smirk grew, he realized she wasn't mistaken at all. She simply didn't believe he belonged there. "Sir, there must be some confusion," she replied, her arms now crossed tightly. "This seat is reserved. First class isn't for people who travel like this. You'll need to go to economy." It was subtle, but everyone around understood exactly what she meant. The hoodie, the casual clothes, and yes, his skin color. That combination, in her mind, meant he didn't fit the image of a first-class traveler. Passengers in nearby seats exchanged looks, a few whispering quietly to each other. One older woman muttered under her breath, "Oh no, not this again." Another passenger shook his head in disbelief and reached for his phone, already recording. What he suspected would turn into a viral video. David could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had lived through situations like this before, moments when people judged him not by his achievements, his success, or his character, but by the clothes on his back and the color of his skin. It wasn't new, but it was always exhausting. Yet he refused to let anger take over. Instead, he gave her a small, polite smile and simply said, "Ma'am, this is my seat. I belong here." The words were calm, but they carried a quiet strength. For the attendant, though, his confidence seemed to make her even more annoyed. Her lips tightened, her tone grew sharper, and she raised her voice just enough so that even the passengers a few rows back could hear. "Sir, I don't want to cause a scene, but if you don't move, I will call security. You will be escorted off this plane." Now the cabin was buzzing. More phones were lifted into the air, cameras recording from multiple angles. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Others leaned forward, clearly eager to see how this confrontation would play out. David sat down anyway, sliding into the plush leather seat, fastening his belt without breaking eye contact. He didn't argue, he didn't shout. He just sat down, as if to say, "This is where I belong, and I won't let anyone tell me otherwise." The flight attendant's face turned red with frustration, her authority challenged in front of a dozen witnesses. She had no idea that the man in the hoodie was not only her passenger, but also one of the most powerful figures her airline would ever encounter. She thought she was putting him in his place, but in reality, she was digging a hole that would bury her career in just a matter of minutes. And that's when everything began to spiral. Because David Cole, the man she dismissed so easily, was about to reveal exactly who he was, and her arrogant judgment would cost her everything. David sat there, calm and collected, but the tension in the air was sharp enough to cut with a knife. The flight attendant stood only a foot away, her hands on her hips, her expression shifting between disbelief and irritation. She had already made up her mind. This man didn't belong in first class, no matter what his ticket said. And the fact that he wasn't backing down only seemed to irritate her more. "Sir," she said again, her voice now firmer and louder, "you are not allowed to sit here. I don't want to repeat myself. First-class passengers dress professionally. They act with a certain level of class, and they don't cause trouble. Please head back to economy before this escalates." That phrase, "before this escalates," made several passengers around them exchange glances. They knew exactly what was happening here. Nobody was blind to the undertones. It wasn't really about David's ticket. It wasn't about the seat. It was about the way he looked. A man in a hoodie, casual jeans, and sneakers, sitting among passengers dressed in suits and designer outfits. To her, that didn't fit her picture of what first class was supposed to be. David, still calm, responded softly, "Ma'am, with all due respect, there's no escalation here. I have my ticket, and this is my assigned seat. I'm not moving anywhere." The way he said it, polite, firm, and completely composed, only seemed to make her angrier. She leaned closer, lowering her voice but not enough that others couldn't. You're making this harder on yourself. People who can afford first class don't usually look like, well, you know what I mean." That single moment froze the cabin. Several passengers gasped out loud. The older woman in seat 3C muttered, "Did she just say that?" While a younger man near the aisle whispered, "This is unbelievable." It was one thing to doubt a ticket, but it was another to openly admit she judged him by appearance. David didn't flinch. Inside, he could feel the sting. It was the same sting he had felt many times before. He had worked his entire life to prove himself in an industry where people rarely expected a black man from a humble background to rise to the very top. And here he was, one of the most powerful CEOs in the world, being told that he didn't look like he belonged in the seat he had paid for. But rather than explode with anger, he leaned back comfortably, buckled his seatbelt, and said in a voice everyone could hear, "I belong here." The flight attendant clenched her jaw, her authority slipping. She looked around at the other passengers, as if expecting someone to back her up, but instead she found phones pointed at her. Nearly half the first-class cabin had their cameras out, quietly recording. She could feel eyes on her, not with support, but with judgment. The humiliation of being filmed only fueled her frustration. Her voice rose again, sharper this time. "Sir, if you don't move right now, I'll have security escort you off this plane. You are disturbing the peace and refusing to follow instructions." Now the whispers turned into a low rumble. Some passengers shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered under their breath. A man in the row behind David called out, "He showed you his ticket. He's in the right seat." A woman chimed in, "You can't treat people this way." But the attendant brushed them off, determined to assert her control. David stayed still, calm as ever, and simply replied, "Call whoever you need. I'm not leaving this seat. It's mine." The standoff stretched longer than anyone expected. The cabin had gone completely silent except for the flight attendant's angry voice and the quiet clicks of recording phones. Even the hum of the aircraft seemed muted under the weight of the moment. 6 minutes might not sound long, but in that tense atmosphere it felt like hours. Passengers were now openly siding with David. A young couple whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "She's going to regret this." Another man muttered, "This is going viral. No way this doesn't hit the internet." The attendant, however, couldn't back down now. Her pride was on the line. To her, if she allowed this man in a hoodie to remain in first class after questioning him, it would make her look weak. So she doubled down, threatening again. "Last chance. Move to economy or I'll have you taken off this flight immediately." David didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten back. Instead, he gave her a steady look that made her pause just for a second, though she quickly shook it off. To her, he was still just a stubborn passenger who didn't fit her image of wealth or status. She had no idea that the man sitting calmly in front of her, wearing that hoodie, controlled more power than she could ever imagine. As she prepared to call the captain, passengers leaned forward in anticipation. The cabin felt electric, buzzing, with the unspoken knowledge that something explosive was about to happen. Everyone could sense it. This wasn't going to end the way the attendant expected. And in just a few short minutes, her career would be turned upside down. Because the man she was trying to kick out of first class wasn't just another passenger. He was about to reveal exactly who he was, and when he did, the entire plane would witness a moment they'd never forget. Minutes dragged by, but they felt like a lifetime. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted from mild curiosity to electric tension. Every passenger knew they were witnessing something far bigger than a seating dispute. Phones were raised, cameras rolling, eyes glued to the unfolding drama. The flight attendant stood stiffly, arms crossed, her jaw tight, her authority slipping away with every passing second that David refused to move. Finally, the curtain to the cockpit slid open, and the captain stepped into the aisle. His crisp white uniform and steady presence silenced the low murmurs in the cabin. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He had been told there was a disruptive passenger in first class refusing to follow instructions. His job was to resolve it quickly so the flight could continue. "What seems to be the problem here?" the captain asked, his voice calm but commanding. The flight attendant jumped at the chance to explain, her tone suddenly polished. "Captain, this gentleman is sitting in a seat that doesn't belong to him. I've asked him multiple times to move to economy, but he's refusing to comply." The captain turned to David, expecting to find someone defensive, maybe even aggressive. Instead, David remained seated, perfectly calm, his seatbelt fastened as if he were preparing for takeoff. He held out his ticket with steady hands. The captain took it, glanced at the seat number, then looked at the row. His brow furrowed. He double-checked the stub, then looked back at the attendant, his voice firm. "This ticket is valid. Seat 2A is his. There's no mistake." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Passengers murmured loudly now, some even chuckling in disbelief. The attendant's face went pale, her confidence cracking like glass under pressure. She tried to recover quickly. "Well, there must have been some mix-up. I didn't see it properly before, but the truth was already clear to everyone. She hadn't made a mistake. She had made a judgment." David slowly unbuckled his belt and stood up, not angrily, not dramatically, but with the composure of someone who knew exactly how much power he held. He turned not just to the captain, but to the entire cabin, raising his voice just enough so everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is David Cole. I am the CEO of Horizon Tech, the company that provides the very software this airline relies on every single day. The booking system, the ticketing system, the employee management system. It all comes from my company. So when I tell you this is my seat, I mean it both as a passenger and as someone who helped build the system that assigned it to me." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The whispers grew louder. Passengers looked at one another in disbelief, their phones capturing every second. Some were shocked by his position, others by his calmness, but all of them realized in that moment that the man in the hoodie wasn't just another traveler. He was someone with immense influence, sitting quietly among them until pushed too far. The flight attendant's smirk was gone. Her lips trembled, her voice weak. I didn't realize who you were." David fixed his gaze on her, his tone steady but cutting. "That's the point. Respect should never depend on who someone is. It shouldn't matter if I'm a CEO or a college student, wearing a hoodie or a three-piece suit. The way you treated He was unprofessional, humiliating, and based on nothing more than your assumptions. Her mouth opened to respond, but no words came out. Around them, passengers nodded in agreement. A woman whispered, "Exactly right." Another added, "Finally, someone said it." The captain, clearly uncomfortable with how badly his crew had handled the situation, looked at David with something close to respect. "Mr. Cole, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. Please remain in your seat. I'll ensure there are no further issues." But David wasn't finished. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking accountability. He turned again to the passengers, many of whom were still recording, and said calmly, "This isn't about me being a CEO. This is about how people are treated when others assume they don't belong. No one should ever be told they're in the wrong place just because of how they look." His words carried weight, echoing across the cabin. Even those who hadn't been paying close attention now felt the gravity of the moment. They weren't just witnessing a passenger standing up for himself. They were witnessing a man turning an ugly situation into a powerful lesson. The flight attendant, her career flashing before her eyes, whispered again, "I didn't mean it like that." But it was too late. The damage was already done, not just to her reputation, but to her future. Because what she didn't yet realize was that David wasn't simply making a point. He was about to make a decision that would change her life forever. The captain motioned for the attendant to step aside, but she hesitated, frozen in place. The camera zoomed in, capturing her panic, her discomfort, her fear. She had gone from feeling powerful to powerless in the span of minutes. The very passenger she had tried to dismiss was now the one holding her professional future in his hands. And as David sat back down, his expression calm but firm, the rest of the cabin leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Because everyone now understood. This wasn't just a confrontation about a seat. This was about respect, dignity, and consequences. And the consequences were coming fast. The flight attendant's hands shook as she tried to explain herself, her words stumbling over one another. "I didn't mean it that way, sir. I was just trying to make sure everything was in order." But her excuses sounded hollow, even to her own ears. The passengers who had witnessed every word weren't buying it, and neither was David. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the kind of weight that made the entire cabin fall silent. "You judged me the moment I walked in here. You saw a man in a hoodie and you decided I didn't belong. You embarrassed me in front of every person here, and you did it with a smile as if it were your right. That's not just a mistake, it's a reflection of how you treat people when you think no one important is watching." The attendant swallowed hard, her face flushed. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked genuinely afraid. Her authority, her confidence, her control over the situation, gone. All that was left was the uncomfortable truth of her actions and the consequences that were now barreling toward her. The captain cleared his throat, trying to ease the tension, but David raised a hand, signaling he wasn't done. "I want you to understand something," he continued, addressing both the attendant and the passengers watching. "Respect is not a gift you hand out only to people you approve of. It's the bare minimum of professionalism. It shouldn't matter who I am. It shouldn't matter what I'm wearing. I could be a student, a teacher, a factory worker, or yes, a CEO. Every single person deserves to be treated with dignity." A murmur of agreement swept through the cabin. Several passengers nodded. Some clapped quietly. One man in the back of first class even called out, "That's exactly right." The atmosphere was shifting. What had started as humiliation was now becoming a powerful moment of truth. David then turned to the captain, his expression calm but resolute. "Effective. Immediately, she is relieved of her duties. I will personally ensure the paperwork is handled with Horizon Tech's HR department as soon as we land. But as of right now, she will not serve another passenger under a system my company oversees." The words hit like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. The attendant's eyes widened in shock, her voice cracking. You can't do that. This isn't fair. I was only doing my job. David shook his head slowly. No. Doing your job is checking tickets and helping passengers. What you did was insult me, question me, and threaten to have me removed when I had done nothing wrong. That is not your job. That is abuse of power, and actions have consequences. The captain looked at David, then at the trembling attendant. He gave a short nod and quietly said, "Miss, please step aside. We'll have another crew member take over your duties." Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality sank in. She tried to argue, her voice desperate now. "Please, you don't understand, I didn't mean—" But the passengers weren't sympathetic. They had seen and heard too much. A woman in row 1 shook her head firmly and muttered, "No excuses, you treated him like dirt." Another passenger added loudly, "You brought this on yourself." As the captain gently guided the attendant down the aisle, the cabin erupted in applause. People clapped, some cheered, and more than a few shouted words of encouragement toward David. "That's justice," one man said loudly. "About time someone stood up to this nonsense." Another added, David didn't bask in the applause. He didn't grin or pump his fists. He simply sat back down, fastened his seatbelt again, and let out a small, almost weary sigh. He didn't enjoy firing people, and he never took pride in watching someone lose their job. But in this case, the lesson was unavoidable. Some mistakes can be corrected with an apology, but others, especially those rooted in prejudice and arrogance, come with consequences that can't be ignored. The replacement flight attendant arrived moments later, clearly nervous, clearly aware of what had just happened. She offered David a respectful smile and asked quietly if he needed anything. David thanked her politely, then leaned back in his seat. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself to relax, but the other passengers weren't ready to let the moment fade. Many of them leaned across the aisle or stood to shake his hand. "Thank you for standing up," a woman said, softly. "My brother went through something similar and no one stood up for him." Another man told him, "You handled that with more calm than most people ever could. You made a point without even raising your voice. The cameras were still recording, but now the tone of the videos had shifted. This wasn't just footage of a confrontation. It was footage of a man taking a stand, with composure, with authority, and with an unshakable sense of justice. David wasn't proud of having to fire someone mid-flight, but as he sipped the coffee the new attendant quietly placed on his tray, he knew this moment was bigger than him. The applause had died down, but the impact of what just happened was only beginning to take root, because while the former flight attendant walked down that aisle stripped of her authority, David had reminded everyone watching, both on the plane and soon on the internet, that respect is not optional. It's the foundation of human decency, and when you strip someone of that respect, you risk losing everything yourself. The flight settled into a calm rhythm after the storm had passed, but the atmosphere in first class was far from ordinary. There was a buzz, a hum of energy that lingered in the air. Passengers kept glancing at David, some whispering to each other, others still holding their phones as if reluctant to stop recording. What they had just witnessed was something they knew would live far beyond that airplane cabin. David sat quietly, his hood pulled slightly forward again, his body finally relaxing into the leather seat. He wasn't a man who enjoyed confrontation, and he certainly wasn't someone who celebrated seeing another person lose their job. But he understood something deeply. There are moments in life where silence only feeds the problem. If he had walked back to economy, if he had given in to the humiliation, it would have reinforced every assumption the flight attendant had made. Instead, he chose to stand firm, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. The new attendant, clearly eager not to repeat her colleague's mistakes, approached him softly. "Mr. Cole, is there anything I can get for you?" Her tone was respectful but also careful, as if she understood she was walking into a moment far bigger than simple customer service. David gave her a small smile and asked only for coffee. She brought it quickly, setting it down gently, and then retreated without another word. But it wasn't the coffee that warmed him. It was the people. One by one, passengers began to approach. A woman in her 50s leaned across the aisle. "Sir, I just want to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My son wears hoodies all the time. He's been stopped in stores, followed, around, even told he doesn't belong in certain places. What you did today, it gives me hope that people will think twice before treating others like that." David listened intently, nodding. "It's not the hoodie," he replied gently. "It's the mindset people bring when they see it. Respect isn't about clothes, it's about character. Your son deserves to be treated with dignity no matter what he wears." Another passenger, a businessman in a tailored suit, extended his hand. "I've flown first class for years, and I've seen attendants treat people differently depending on how they look. I never said anything. Watching you handle this calmly, without anger, it was powerful. You made a statement without shouting." David shook his hand firmly. "Sometimes the loudest message is delivered quietly," he said. Phones buzzed as social media lit up. Clips of the confrontation were already spreading, gaining traction even before the plane touched the ground. Hashtags began forming, passengers showing each other their feeds with wide eyes. "You're already going viral," one young man whispered excitedly to David. But David only smiled faintly. Going viral wasn't his goal, changing minds was. The hours passed, but the energy never fully faded. People looked at him differently. Now, not just as a man in a hoodie who had proven he belonged, but as someone who had used his influence to shine a light on a problem that many tried to ignore. Even those who had sat silently during the confrontation now seemed eager to connect, to express their gratitude, or simply to nod in quiet respect. When the plane finally landed, the passengers gathered their belongings, but not before several more stopped by his seat. A young woman whispered, "My little brother would have been crushed if this happened to him. Seeing you stand tall, it means more than you know." A middle-aged man simply said, "Thank you, for all of us." David stood, pulling his hoodie over his head again, ready to exit. He wasn't walking off the plane as just another passenger anymore. He was walking off as a symbol of something larger. The reminder that respect is not optional, and that dignity belongs to everyone, no matter what they look like, no matter what they wear. By the time he stepped into the terminal, his phone was buzzing non-stop. His assistant had already sent him messages. "You're trending." Every major outlet wants a statement. People are calling this a turning point. But David didn't rush to respond. He didn't need to. The videos spoke louder than any press release ever could. For the flight attendant who had mocked him, the consequences were swift. Within days, the airline announced her termination, citing unprofessional behavior. For David, however, the story became something much greater. News anchors replayed the footage, social media platforms overflowed with commentary, and communities everywhere discussed the lesson. Judging someone by appearance is not just wrong, it's dangerous, and it can destroy trust in an instant. In an interview later that week, David summed it up perfectly. "I wore a hoodie because I wanted to be comfortable on a flight, that's all. But the fact that it was enough for someone to decide I didn't belong says everything about the assumptions people still carry. I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. And I hope this moment reminds everyone that you never know who you're speaking to, or what battles they've fought just to sit where they are. It wasn't about being a CEO. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about respect. And that was the message that traveled farther than any airplane ever could.